When the P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared over Europe in early 1943, German pilots didn't see a threat. They saw a joke. Compared to the sleek, knife-sharp Bf-109S and the agile FW-190S, the Thunderbolt looked like an overweight brute, too big, too heavy, too sluggish, and too clumsy to survive a dogfight over the Reich. Luftwaffe intelligence reports mocked its silhouette, claiming that such a massive airframe was unsuitable for nimble combat, and pilots joked that it was more comparable to a bomber than a fighter. In the opening months, those German assumptions seemed reinforced by the P-47's early performance record. It struggled to climb quickly, suffered from radio issues, and its turbo supercharger system caused unpredictable behavior at lower altitudes. Many German aces considered it an embarrassment to American engineering, an aircraft designed by people who fundamentally misunderstood the physics of aerial warfare. They were so confident, in fact, that they openly encouraged their rookies to engage Thunderbolts in combat. But underneath those layers of ridicule and misplaced confidence, the Luftwaffe had failed to grasp something crucial. The P-47 was not built for traditional European dogfighting doctrine. It was built for altitude, durability, and raw destructive power. Three traits that would soon transform it from a laughingstock into one of the most feared machines in the sky. Even before its true potential was unleashed, the Thunderbolt carried signs of a design unlike anything frontline German pilots had faced. It was enormous because of what it housed: a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a turbo supercharger system nearly as large as some lightweight fighters, and an airframe engineered to withstand punishment that would tear most aircraft apart. Early combat footage showed P-47s returning to base with holes large enough to fit a man's arm through the fuselage. Others came back with cylinders shot out, pistons damaged, or control surfaces shredded, yet still flying. Its dive speed also eclipsed anything the Luftwaffe operated. While the Bf-109 and FW-190 risked structural failure in steep plunges, the Thunderbolt remained stable, descending faster than any prop-driven fighter of the war. But none of this mattered yet. The Luftwaffe didn't fear its toughness. They didn't fear its speed. They didn't fear its size. What they truly underestimated, fatally, was its firepower. The Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of unleashing more than 100 rounds per second. In early encounters, German pilots dismissed them as American overkill, assuming that no pilot could effectively aim that many guns at once. But American air doctrine had been crafted around overwhelming firepower. If one line of fire didn't hit, another would. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the Thunderbolt didn't just shoot, it carved tunnels through enemy aircraft. On gun camera footage, German fighters hit by full bursts didn't merely fall apart, they disintegrated mid-air. And as the Americans refined their tactics, diving from high altitude and delivering devastating slashing attacks, Luftwaffe pilots realized the uncomfortable truth: the machine they had jeered at was about to rewrite the rules of the air war. What had once been a flying barrel was quickly becoming the most dangerous opponent Germany had ever misjudged. The turning point came in the summer of 1943, when the P-47 finally began fighting the way it had been designed to fight. Early missions had forced Thunderbolt pilots into low-altitude engagements where the aircraft's weight and turbo supercharger were liabilities. But once American commanders shifted the P-47 to high-altitude escort duties, its entire personality changed. Suddenly, the same German pilots who once joked about the flying milk churn found themselves being stalked from 25,000 feet by a fighter that could dive faster, hit harder, and absorb more punishment than anything they had ever faced. The Luftwaffe relied heavily on surprise attacks launched from above against Allied bombers. But now, when German formations climbed to position themselves above the incoming B-17 or B-24s, they discovered something new waiting for them: Thunderbolts already higher than they were. With its massive supercharger, the P-47 performed best where the air was thin, so thin that German fighters, especially the Bf-109G, struggled to maintain power. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots realized the Americans had a machine engineered for a type of fight the Germans could not control. Combat reports from the period reveal a shift in tone. Early remarks mocked the Thunderbolt's size. By late 1943, the same pilots wrote warnings: "Do not let them dive on you, avoid vertical engagements, and most tellingly, their firepower is overwhelming." The joke was evaporating quickly. And then the gun camera footage began pouring in, reels of German fighters being shredded by 8 converging streams of .50 caliber fire, not in seconds, but in fractions of a second. It was the first time the Luftwaffe understood what it meant to underestimate a fighter that had been designed around lethality rather than elegance. German tactics began to unravel under the pressure. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine relied on high-speed hit-and-run attacks against bomber formations. Approach from above, dive through the formation, fire a short burst, and escape before escort fighters intervened. But Thunderbolts patrolling above the bombers flipped the script. German fighters now found themselves on the receiving end of American boom-and-zoom tactics, where P-47s dove from superior altitude, unleashed their 8.5s, and then zoom climbed away before the Luftwaffe could counterattack. These weren't gentle dives. The Thunderbolt could plummet at over 500 miles per hour without coming apart, a speed that made German pursuit nearly impossible. The Bf-109's wings wobbled and lost structural integrity under such pressure. The FW-190 vibrated so severely that pilots risked blackout. The P-47 simply pointed its massive nose down and became a falling anvil with guns. And when those guns opened up, the results were catastrophic. A full power burst from 8 Brownings equaled the destructive force of light cannon fire, and it tore through Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs as if their airframes were made of thin plywood. German pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt now described its strikes as brutal and impossible to survive. The psychological effect was immediate. Rookie Luftwaffe pilots began avoiding P-47s altogether. Even seasoned aces refused to engage a Thunderbolt in a dive, knowing that doing so was suicide. What had been a laughingstock only months earlier was now forcing the Luftwaffe to rewrite its tactics mid-war, something they could not afford. In the skies over Germany, the Hunter had become the hunted, and the aircraft the Luftwaffe laughed at was beginning to claim their most experienced pilots with cold mechanical efficiency. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt was no longer just holding its own. It was dominating the air war in a way that stunned even its own pilots. What shocked the Luftwaffe most wasn't merely the P-47's speed in a dive or its brutal firepower, but its ability to survive attacks that would obliterate any other fighter. German aces who prided themselves on pinpoint marksmanship found that shooting down a Thunderbolt was nothing like engaging a Spitfire or a lightly built P-51. The P-47 could lose cylinders, control cables, chunks of wing surfaces, and still keep flying. One pilot returned to base with a basketball-sized hole punched completely through his fuselage, so large that ground crews could see daylight on the other side. Another came back with the entire canopy blown off, his radio destroyed, and his oxygen system leaking. Yet the engine kept turning, the airframe held together, and the plane limped home on raw stubbornness. This resilience rattled German morale in a way Allied commanders didn't initially appreciate. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to strike fast, break enemy formations, and disable aircraft with short bursts. But the Thunderbolt simply ignored damage that would kill a Bf-109 outright. Reports began circulating among German squadrons describing P-47s that refused to fall or absorbed fire unnaturally. Some pilots even believed the Americans had armored their fighters like tanks, and in a sense, they had. The P-47 carried more armor plating than any other single-engine fighter of the war. Its supercharger ducts doubled as structural reinforcement, and its sheer mass meant that rounds which shattered lighter fighters often only scarred a Thunderbolt. What the Luftwaffe had dismissed as poor design was now proving to be the biggest reason their own aces didn't come home. But the Thunderbolt's evolution didn't stop there. As the P-47D models rolled out with bubble canopies, improved climb rates, paddle-bladed propellers, and refined turbo-superchargers, the aircraft's combat performance transformed again. German pilots, expecting the slow, lumbering brute of 1943, suddenly encountered a Thunderbolt that climbed faster, accelerated harder, and dove with murderous velocity. At medium and high altitudes, it was nearly untouchable. Its massive engine allowed it to regain altitude after an attack faster than German fighters could react. And because American formations flew deep into German airspace, Thunderbolts increasingly encountered fuel-limited Luftwaffe interceptors forced to break off engagements prematurely. The result was a psychological collapse. Luftwaffe squadrons that once mocked the Thunderbolt began issuing internal memos urging caution, advising pilots to avoid prolonged combat with P-47s, and warning that engaging at high altitude was ill-advised. Even the legendary Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units, admitted that the P-47 was becoming a serious threat. Ace Heinz Behr famously remarked that Thunderbolts hit like anti-aircraft guns, and another pilot claimed that a single burst from a P-47 felt like being hit by a wall of iron. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a force multiplier. It crippled bomber attacks from above, hunted German fighters on the climb, and then switched roles entirely in the afternoon, sweeping low over rail lines, convoys, and airfields, obliterating targets with bombs, rockets, and those same 8.50 caliber guns. The Thunderbolt had become the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare not because it was perfect, but because it refused to be the aircraft the Germans assumed it was. Every flaw they mocked had become a strength. Every limitation they laughed at had been engineered into an advantage, and the sky over Europe was beginning to tilt decisively in America's favor. By mid-1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a high-altitude interceptor or a bomber escort. It had evolved into a multi-role monster that reshaped the entire air war over Europe. When the Allies invaded Normandy on June 6th, the Luftwaffe attempted to contest the skies with everything it had left. German pilots believed the chaos of the low-altitude battlefield, smoke, dust, explosions, shifting formations, would neutralize the Thunderbolt's strengths. Instead, they found themselves facing an aircraft that had become even deadlier below the clouds. The P-47, with its nearly indestructible airframe and absurd dive speed, was perfectly suited for the violently shifting environment over the beaches. It could dive straight into the chaos, unload its 8.5s, and pull out with a margin of safety that German fighters simply didn't have. From the first hour of D-Day until the breakout from Normandy, the Thunderbolt claimed German fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and even armored vehicles. Once again, the Luftwaffe misread the Thunderbolt, not realizing that its too heavy design gave it tremendous stability during low-level attacks. And when the invasion pushed inland, the Germans' worst fears materialized. Swarms of P-47s began roving across France in aggressive, unpredictable hunting packs. They patrolled roads, bridges, rail lines, and airfields, often attacking targets before German ground units even knew they had been spotted. The Thunderbolt ended the Luftwaffe's ability to move freely, striking fuel depots, trains, and troop columns with such ferocity that German units began traveling only at night. By day, the sound of a P-47 engine, deep, rumbling, unmistakable, became a warning sign to scatter and hide. The aircraft the Germans had laughed at was now the one dictating when and where they could fight. But the Thunderbolt's dominance didn't end with air superiority. In the chaos of summer 1944, it found a new identity: tankbuster. With the Luftwaffe collapsing and German armored divisions trying to stabilize the front, the P-47 turned its devastating firepower toward the ground. Its 8.5s could slice open half-tracks, armored cars, and soft-skinned vehicles with ease. Its rockets shattered tanks, artillery, and even fortified positions. And when loaded with 500 or 1,000-pound bombs, the Thunderbolt became a precision wrecking ball. German crews described the sight of P-47s diving overhead as the beginning of the end. Even elite units like the Panzer Lehr Division, some of the best trained armored forces in the Reich, were mauled by Thunderbolt strikes during the Normandy campaign. Bomber groups often returned home with Thunderbolt escorts so riddled with flak holes that maintenance crews expected to find the pilots dead. Yet they climbed out, shaken but alive, because the aircraft simply refused to die. Its radial engine could take hits that would instantly kill a liquid-cooled fighter. Its thick, wide wings absorbed punishment like shields. Airfields across Europe saw P-47s return with entire cylinders blown off, oil spraying across the canopy, and the engine running on sheer defiance. And through it all, the 8.50 caliber guns remained the Thunderbolt's identity. The reason German pilots, once arrogant and dismissive, now dove away the moment a P-47 lined up behind them. As American forces pressed toward the Rhine and the Reich began to collapse under the weight of non-stop aerial assault, one truth became unavoidable. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer the lumbering curiosity the Luftwaffe once mocked. It was the single-engine fighter they feared most. The sky over Western Europe didn't belong to Germany anymore. It belonged to the Thunderbolt. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the elite, disciplined force that had dominated the early war. It was a bleeding, exhausted shadow of itself, short on fuel, short on pilots, and constantly hunted by Allied fighters. And no aircraft hunted harder than the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Americans had refined their tactics into a deadly, unforgiving method. Thunderbolts operated in roving, fast-moving strike groups known as fighter sweeps, whose single mission was to tear apart anything the Luftwaffe tried to put in the sky. Their strategy was simple: dominate altitude, dive with overwhelming speed, unleash all 8.5s in a 2-second burst, and climb back up before the Germans could respond. These hit-and-run attacks were devastating. Veteran aces who once ruled the skies, men who had fought in the Battle of Britain, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, now found themselves being bounced by opponents they never even saw coming. Many Luftwaffe pilots died without firing a shot. Others bailed out of crippled aircraft, shaken and humiliated by a fighter they had once thought inferior in every way. The Thunderbolt also began hitting German airfields directly, destroying fighters on the ground faster than they could be replaced. In some regions, Luftwaffe squadrons lost more aircraft to P-47 strafing runs than to aerial combat. The 8 Brownings shredded parked fighters, tore open fuel depots, and slashed across runways with such destructive force that the sound of approaching Thunderbolts triggered mass evacuations. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, but by this point they were reacting to American moves, not dictating them. Every attempt to regroup or reorganize was met with yet another wave of P-47s raining lead across their positions. The sky that Germany had once hoped to dominate was now their most dangerous enemy. Yet the Thunderbolt's legend grew even larger on the ground. By 1945, the P-47 had taken on a role no one originally imagined for it: close air support for advancing Allied troops, especially during the push into Germany. No aircraft of the war combined speed, survivability, and sheer destructive capability the way the Thunderbolt did. It could carry rockets that tore open tanks, 500 to 1,000-pound bombs that obliterated entrenched positions, and of course its 8.50s that could saw through convoys, locomotives, and armored columns with terrifying ease. German troops described the P-47 as the vulture that waits above the battlefield, ready to pounce the moment movement was detected. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, Thunderbolts became decisive. Despite freezing temperatures, snow, fog, and treacherous visibility, P-47 pilots took off whenever a window opened. They hit panzer divisions struggling to push through narrow forest roads, destroyed bridges, blasted fuel trucks, and immobilized armored spearheads with relentless precision. Some Thunderbolts returned with so much battle damage that mechanics couldn't understand how the plane stayed airborne. One famously landed with an entire cylinder bank destroyed, half its engine missing, and still taxied to a stop. Its pilot, ice forming on his mask, climbed out, and simply said, "She brought me home." Stories like these spread through the ranks. To American troops on the ground, the P-47 became a guardian angel. To German soldiers, it became a curse word. To the Luftwaffe, it became the symbol of their downfall. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, German pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt now whispered warnings. "If you see a P-47 diving, don't fight, just pray." The machine they laughed at had become the one that crushed them. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe was collapsing on every front, starved of fuel, abandoned by logistics, and stripped of the veteran pilots who had once made it the most formidable air force in the world. And woven through that collapse was the unmistakable silhouette of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Heavy, loud, oversized, and utterly unstoppable. German pilots who had survived from the early war years could scarcely believe what they were facing. The same aircraft they had openly mocked in 1943 was now the one dominating their final months in the sky. Reports from surviving Luftwaffe officers paint a picture of disbelief and frustration. Young replacements, rushed into combat with barely a month of training, were told to avoid Thunderbolts altogether. Even hardened aces learned to fear the sudden roar of a diving P-47 above the clouds. They knew what came next. A streak of silver cutting through the air, 8.50 caliber guns lighting up simultaneously, and a shearing wall of projectiles tearing through wood, aluminum, and flesh alike. In the final months of the Reich, Thunderbolts roamed freely across German airspace, hunting aircraft, locomotives, supply convoys, armored divisions, communication lines, anything that moved, anything that burned, anything that still held the front together. The Luftwaffe's last attempts to regroup were shattered before they began. Even the introduction of Germany's advanced jets, the Me-262, couldn't shift the tide. The jets were too few, too fragile, too fuel-starved, and too heavily hunted on takeoff and landing by Thunderbolt patrols. That was the final irony. The aircraft Germany mocked as too slow to matter was the one waiting for their cutting-edge jet fighters when they were most vulnerable. German aces spoke openly after the war about the humiliation of being pinned down by a machine they had written off as a joke. The laughter that once echoed in their briefings had died years earlier, replaced by the cold understanding that they had underestimated an enemy they didn't fully understand. When victory finally came in May 1945, the Thunderbolt stood as one of the most successful fighters in the entire European theater. It destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air. It obliterated tens of thousands of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, and trains on the ground. It provided relentless close air support to Allied troops from Normandy to the Rhine. And, perhaps most importantly, it helped shatter the Luftwaffe's will to fight, not just through firepower, but through psychological dominance. Pilots who flew the P-47 remembered it with reverence. Soldiers on the ground remembered it with gratitude, and the Luftwaffe remembered it with regret. The Germans had mocked it because it didn't fit their definition of beauty or finesse in aerial combat. But war has no interest in elegance. War rewards power, resilience, reliability, and the ability to dish out punishment while surviving the return fire. The Thunderbolt embodied all of these in excess. Its immense frame housed the heart of a bruiser and the soul of a survivor. It was not the most maneuverable fighter. It wasn't the prettiest. It wasn't the fastest. But it was, without question, one of the deadliest machines ever to dominate the skies of World War II. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately the story of a lesson paid for with thousands of German lives. Never judge a fighter by its size, its shape, or even its first-generation flaws. Because sometimes the aircraft you laugh at in peacetime becomes the one that obliterates you in war. And in the cold statistics of the air war over Europe, one truth stands above all others. No fighter in the USAAF destroyed more enemy aircraft, more tanks, or more war-critical infrastructure than the machine that German aces once dismissed with a smile. Their laughter didn't just fade, it was drowned out, by 8 roaring .50 caliber guns that rewrote the fate of the skies.